Otherwise, what they will find is that a side pocket will continue for a number of years, and all the value of that side pocket will get drained away by fees. And at the end of the realisation process, there will be nothing left to pay to the investors who rank behind, who are equity ranking behind the debt claim of the fees.
Could I ask a question of our Cayman panelist?
Please.
There has been court rulings on the issue of what constitutes a fund that is still an ongoing business. And this relates particularly to whether or not an investor or group of investors can force a liquidation of the fund under the grounds that it's no longer carrying on the business that it said it would under its articles, etc. Does the fact that a side pocket has impaired a fund's assets alone justify investors going to try to liquidate the entire fund, or does the whole fund have to be impaired?
No, unfortunately, if you're liquidating, they're looking at liquidating a whole company, and that would be all its assets, not just a side pocket. So the side pocket, even one of 20%, is not going to come into play. Those cases, there's a couple of different grounds on which investors can take the nuclear option of trying to wind up the whole company. One is pure, straightforward liquidation on the grounds it's insolvent, in that they've redeemed their shares, they're owed money as a result, the company can't pay its debts, and therefore it should be wound up. That's a sort of relatively straightforward one. The more difficult one is the more generic concept of just and equitable, and that's where we talk about whether the fund is actually operating as it was before. And that requires a shareholder or group of shareholders to come forward and say, we all invested in this fund took our money, was supposed to invest in various different bits and pieces and produce a return. What has actually happened is it's all ground to a halt. It's not doing what it said before, it's not operating as was intended at the time, and therefore the best thing the court can do here is just say, okay, it's got to be wound up. And that's what those series of cases were. So I think in order to bring one under just and equitable, you've got to show substantially the assets are impaired. And then that will be, yes, anything in a side pocket would automatically be regarded as impaired. I don't think a court would say, well, it's in the offering document, therefore that's normal operation. But it would have to be a large part of the assets.
Okay. We have a question from someone following this webcast, which is that what types of hedge fund assets are the most distressed, and do they include hedge fund products, and if so, what are the problems with those? And to a certain extent we've touched upon this, but nonetheless I thought I'd formally ask the question as it was put to us.
Certainly, and they do. Our role is to run our fund-of-fund portfolios, and within those portfolios, surprisingly, there are investments in further fund-of-funds. And in fact, the worst example that we've seen is 4 layers of fund-of-funds. So a fund of funds invests in another fund of funds, which invests in another fund of funds, which invests in a fund. And you can imagine the layer of fees that generated, which was utterly astounding, and also the impact of leverage on the whole process. So while things were going very well, nobody really noticed or cared. But when things started to go bad, it exacerbated that problem hugely. So yes, there are fund-of-fund assets that are distressed, and that is certainly the class that we're dealing with. The fund-of-funds, the assets within those fund-of-funds that tend to be the ones that are most illiquid now are the pipe funds that have been referred to earlier, structured products where the liquidity drained out of the market as a result of the operations of banks that everybody's familiar with, the types of special situations funds where they were investing in specific assets, quite often in emerging markets, which were difficult to liquidate. So those are the typical types of assets that we see in the portfolios that we're dealing with at the moment.
Okay.
It's worth just bearing in mind on side pockets that they're only supposed to be used where normally if you look at fund documents, it's where it's very illiquid or impossible to price. And what we've seen from investors is starting to look at claims based on the fact that managers see this as a convenient receptacle for things that have just shot down in value. And so the fact that the share price or whatever it may be, the price has gone to a fraction of what was paid for it originally, does not mean it's a candidate for being put in the side pocket. So you would have remedies against the manager, and we have seen those starting to come out.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, if one looks back 5 years ago or further, you saw side pockets basically reflecting minority holdings in private shares. And of course, today, the best example would be Facebook, but I'm sure that's not a particular liquidity problem. But those are the kind of side pockets we used to see 5+ years ago. And in those cases, the classic performance fee was not charged until the investment had been sold and cash realized. So, and it was booked at acquisition cost and held at the lower cost or market. I would add, by the way, to the illiquid securities, since the 2008 crisis, really the mortgage-backed securities have been dumped into the side pocket category.
Right.
Yeah.
So, can I come on to the part of the discussion? What is it? How would an investor that's following this discussion? What are the first, second, and third steps that he or she can take if they find themselves in a situation? Let's say they're not that familiar with the industry as you are. What are the practical things that they can do to get themselves out of the difficulty that they are in? Let's say they're a pension fund that's going through a fund of hedge funds, or even directly, but they're not that close to the situation. What do? Do they contact their lawyer and try and get something done?
But there is, I mean, it's worth, I mean, what would I say? I'd say the first thing is speak to the manager, because you're going to have to get your facts anyway, and that's got to be an information exercise. Yes, I mean, if you're investing in hedge funds, you should have counsel somewhere along the line anyway, and they will be able to advise you. But your first steps must be to try and reach agreement, and also find out, which probably Mark knows better about, find out exactly what all other shareholders are doing. So if you're trying to do something on your own, you're going to struggle unless you're a major investor. What you're saying, that's not the sort of person you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah. And absolutely, you need to get advice. Typically in this situation, I wouldn't necessarily go to the lawyer first. The lawyer is someone to consider using when you get to a point where you're reaching your last resort. Litigation is an expensive process. You need to go to an advisor who is experienced in dealing with these types of situations, who knows the market, especially for illiquid assets.
How many of those people are there out there?
Not many, I don't think. There are a few. There are a few specialists, but knowing what you own is the most important thing to establish first of all.
And how do you do that?
Well, if you can find an appropriate advisor, and if you can't find one initially, certainly speak to your lawyers or accountants, or your fund of fund manager should be able to help you. So the person who advised you in the process of going into those hedge fund assets should be able to point you in the right direction. It is then important to establish the way that the manager has behaved, a lot of detailed information about the underlying fund. For example, when was the last net asset value produced? How reliable was that net asset value calculation? Have any redemption proceeds been paid over the last period of time? Has the manager produced any information to its investors relating to future liquidity in the fund? You need to gather that information first to understand what you own. And only once you know what you own can you start to formulate a plan. That plan may involve some secondary sales. that plan may involve trying to establish communications with other investors in the same fund. And I believe one useful thing out of the legal process that has come about recently has been more litigation around the ability of investors to obtain information on who all the other investors are, so that they can actually contact them and try to establish a group with a view to speaking to the manager with a single voice.
The only caveat I'd add to that is, in terms of speaking to lawyers, speaking to your lawyer doesn't automatically end you up in litigation. And what they will... although it's far better for me if it does. No, most of the time, a lot of it has happened. Remember, most of the changes we saw when hedge funds want to tie you in for longer and have longer lockups and so on, they actually need your consent to do it. And that does put you in a negotiating position. And sometimes it is the case, particularly with larger managers, that if you're being looked after by a lawyer, you are taken more seriously. And I've seen that from advising the managers as well. That's just a caveat to what you're saying, which I agree with entirely.
Right. In the few minutes that remain, what I'd like to do is explore the possibility, at least, that we more could be done on a sort of industry-wide level. It seems to be there's a lot of little fragmented parts of this, and not enough being done across the piece. As a result, I wonder whether or not there is something, maybe you, Mark, maybe you, Gray, or somebody should be doing to get this going on an industry-wide basis. Is there some sort of industry-wide platform that could be established, do you think?
I think one of the routes is codes of practice, and AIMA are very good at most things, and perhaps that's a route forward. I think that the difficulty with that is the way that different funds have handled this whole situation has been very different. And some have been incredibly shareholder friendly. They've explained the problem straight up front. They've said, if we tie you in for 18 months, we think at that time this will be the situation, and a lot of them are proving to be very right. And they've said them, others dug their heels in, have been obfuscating, making life very difficult. I think the only way a real change is going to happen, because you've got such diverse investors, diverse funds, is if it came through an industry body.
Right. John, can you hear us?
Yes, I do.
Okay, we've had some technical problems, I understand, with the link with you in Washington. So we can get a better picture. Well, you're coming through on the phone now. Okay.
Fine.
Okay. I don't know whether you heard that last bit. I just said, is there anything that could be done that's not being done on an industry-wide level that could reasonably and practically be done to alleviate this problem? Because I said that I think there's a number of people, three of which are on this this webcast this afternoon, have some interest in it, but there's no one bringing it all together at the moment. And I think that's potentially something that could be looked at.
I think some pressure could be placed upon the regulators, especially here in the United States, where come this July, it's estimated that we will have over 4,000 investment advisors deregister from the SEC. And this is as a result of the Dodd-Frank Act that basically creates a $150 million cutoff. So let's take the example of a $300 million hedge fund, which as a result of the 2008 crisis and redemptions ends up now with assets under $150 million. If they weren't SEC registered before, they would now be not under SEC registration starting in July and go under the jurisdiction of the local state regulator. And